666.
The International Monetary Fund, IMF, recently concluded its Article 4 consultations with Saudi Arabia. So, Lucian, I actually chose this one big thing, not only for the newsy element, but to also force myself to do a little research on IMF consultations. As viewers may have noticed, every now and then I'll take on a topic simply because I don't know much about it and I'd like to learn more, so I'm forcing myself. So first, the newsy part. Good news, exclamation point, for Saudi Arabia. The report concludes that Saudi Arabia is growing at the fastest rate in a decade, is likely to lead global economies with GDP growth of 7.6% projected for 2022. Some key findings from the report: despite higher prices across the board, inflation will remain contained at 2.8%. Public finances and external position will strengthen substantially thanks to increased non-oil revenue and higher proceeds from oil exports. IMF envisions a budget surplus of 5.5% of GDP this year. Saudi Arabia is taking impressive steps to improve the business environment, attract foreign investment, and create private sector employment. These initiatives, combined with governance, labor market reform, have made it easier to do business, increased the number of industrial facilities, and raised female participation in the labor force. Growing digitalization has the potential to boost productivity given a young population. Digitalization accelerated during the pandemic. And you think that was an Arabic name? I'm struggling with digitalization. Accelerated during the pandemic, including through online health services, virtual courts, distance learning, and an online finance platform for public procurement known as Etimad. The report's conclusion is that, quote, Saudi Arabia's economic outlook is strong. Maintaining the kingdom's long-term prosperity depends crucially on sustaining the reform momentum. So they love what Saudi Arabia is doing. This is so it's a really good positive report almost across the board. Now, quickly to the short research part, and this may be of interest because Article 4 consultations are everywhere. So basically, there are 190 member countries in the IMF. Saudi Arabia joined in 1957.
Whoa, that's way longer ago than I thought. No, I was going to say
guess?
56.
I thought you might guess.
No, I purposefully did not guess so as not to be decades off.
It shows your good judgment. When you join the IMF, you agree to what is termed country surveillance, and that includes regular, usually annual, comprehensive consultations. These are mandated by Article 4 of the IMF's Articles of Agreement, hence Article 4 consultations. Now, during an Article 4 consultation, an IMF team of economists visits the country to assess economic and financial developments and discuss the country's economic and financial policies with government and central bank officials. IMF staff missions also often meet with parliamentarians and representatives of business and civil society. And this is not just, they don't fly in and fly out. They come in and set up shop and they stay there for a little bit. So this cycle of meetings in Saudi Arabia was completed on June 7th with the report just now published. For reference, U.S. is a member of IMF. They get one every year too. It's like an exam. This year's Article 4 consultations for the U.S. was published July 12th. If you want to read some of the analysis, I recommend the IMF's, quote, Saudi Arabia Selected Issues publication. That can be downloaded at, I'll send you the link, Lucian.
IMF.org. It should be, I think we got it right this time, even though I'm wearing my headphones on the wrong ear. So I should be, I just noticed that, but it should be there. Anyway, right, it's right there. Right. Yeah, look there.
Anyway, so I'll get that to you. So a little background on Article 4 consultations, your comprehensive economic and financial checkup courtesy of the IMF.
Nice. So it's like a doctor coming into the country and being like, hey, how's your economy doing?
I had some analogies, but they're inappropriate for radio.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one big thing this week, Richard, because when that report came out, it was headline grabbing. I mean, Saudi Arabia has a very good shot at being the fastest growing economy in the world this year. And obviously it's because of oil prices, but there is a lot of good information in there and positive data for Saudi Arabia on non-oil GDP and non-oil GDP growth. It really is just bucking the global trend on there's a sort of a global economic recession or maybe just like a slowdown. It's kind of hard to say at this point, but what the IMF is saying is that Saudi Arabia is heading in literally the opposite direction. It's also interesting too, Richard, that this report, the IMF sort of gives advice, sort of like a doctor might. You either follow it or you don't. But
it does.
The IMF said that Saudi Arabia should resume letting domestic energy prices rise as part of efforts to reduce consumption and help in hitting reduction targets for emissions. And then Saudi Arabia says, well, okay, that's pretty good advice. We may or may not do that. We do have energy price caps, and they're there for partially political reasons, partially economic reasons. But yeah, no, I mean, this is. And we're going to have all the right there. We'll have all of the sort of graphs and different stuff that the IMF put out right there for the YouTube viewers. But yeah, this report was big news for Saudi Arabia. I mean, really good news for Saudi Arabia.
Well, it's nice because it's an impartial source, and it's an in-depth, comprehensive, examination done by economists and people who are trained to do exactly what they're doing in terms of these economic and financial forensics. So it's, you can look at it and have some confidence in its conclusions, and its conclusions are, extremely positive. And they do go out of their way to say that, much of what's been put in place, the direction is a positive and promising. And they encourage, obviously, that this trend and trajectory continues. And they also always throw in, and I always like to see it thrown in, they encourage, continued fiscal responsibility, which the government, Saudi government, has shown. So a glowing report, really.
It's funny, Richard, because we have, this show is really economics focused, trade, commerce, we do a lot of stuff. I mean, we had a really great interview with Ahmed Shawli last week that was, on the Saudi music scene. But, we of the 57 guests, more than that now, because we've had a couple episodes with multiple guests. It's like it's got to be, and we should go back and do this, but it's got to be a large percentage of them have had at least some experience working at the IMF. And so, it's just, I'm just sort of thinking like that usually comes up in my readout, like, oh, and did a stint at the IMF, and you're like, oh, well, that's so it is a global organization.
To that point, Dr. Saad Al-Shahrani, who our guest this week, we were talking about his background, and it's an incredible background. But he spoke specifically about how valuable his time as an economist at IMF. He spent 5 years there, I believe 4 or 5 years. He said it was just a tremendous learning experience, and that it was something he had always aspired to be an economist in IMF. And he's gone on to even greater things. But yeah, to your point, there you go. It seems to be at the nexus of a lot of people's careers and journeys. Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, our very first guest on the 966, who will always be on a pantheon, on a platform of his own,
Abdullah Hassan.
Abdullah Hassan, at the IMF. So
yep.